Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Fall in Love with Morning Time parent session. I'm Pam Barnhill, and I am so happy that you're joining us here this afternoon to talk about one of my very favorite things in the world. I'm not a poetry expert, but I sure do love poetry, and I love to talk about it. So this is so much fun. And I'm here with David Kern from the Cersei Institute and the Daily Poem. And he is going to be sharing some information with us about how we can make poetry a daily habit as opposed to something that we need to get kind of all worked up about and it being an assignment and literature class kinds of things. So this is going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes, a brief little technology overview. While I'm doing that and introducing you guys to David, would you just kind of tell us where you're listening from this afternoon if you're not in the middle of folding laundry or doing dishes? Because I know that a lot of you guys are doing that. And let me make sure that your chat is set right so you guys can actually chat with each other as well. So quick technology stuff before we get started. I am going to let you guys chat with us and each other throughout the whole thing. Normally I shut your kids down and make them only chat with the panelists, but you guys can chat freely throughout the event. Any questions that you put in the chat, I will see and David will see, so we can answer those questions for you. There is kind of a raise your hand and a ask a question box. You don't have to use those. I mean, we're not going to be so rolling so fast in the chat that we're going to miss anything. So if you want to just use the chat exclusively, that's great. And then if you have any technical problems, if you have any sound problems where you stop being able to hear us, or if you have any problems where you stop being able to see us, those can almost always be solved by exiting out of Zoom and clicking the link and coming back in again. So if just leave and come back, and that usually fixes whatever problem that we have. So, and then if you have any other questions, just let us know in the chat. But today we are joined by David Kern from the Cersei Institute and the Daily Poem Podcast. And David has a passion for poetry. He also has a passion for the Green Bay Packers, which is kind of fun.
This is true.
I'm checking out your bio now. He is the managing editor of Forma magazine, and he writes for the Cersei Institute blog. You can find some of his writings over there, along with some other places online. And he is married to Bethany, and they have 3 boys and 1 girl. And all of your kids are on the young side, right, David?
Yes. Our oldest just turned 8. So we have 8, almost 7, 3, and 11 months old.
Okay, so yeah, lots and lots of fun there. And so I'm just going to turn it over to David. And if you guys have any questions at any time, feel free to drop them in the chat. If we don't get to them right away, we will get to them before we go.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Pam. I'm going to share my screen here in a second. Hopefully I can get the technology to work. My mouse was shutting down on me a second ago. But thanks for inviting me, Pam, and thanks to everyone for being here. It's an honor. I think that's the best word to be able to be here and to speak with you. I am always honored to be able to talk with homeschooling parents because, in some ways, it's a challenge in the best way. I think homeschooling parents are so thoughtful and kind and hardworking, and in that way are a inspiration and a challenge for me. You mentioned my kids are young, and my wife and I talk all the time about how my job puts me in contact with so many homeschooling parents, moms and dads, almost every day, and that gives me a pretty good perspective on how amazing most homeschooling parents are. And so that's kind of a challenge for us as we are trying to homeschool our kids, and we're kind of getting started. It's pretty new for us, and in some cases it's basically just morning time some days. But the quality of homeschooling parents out there is definitely an inspiration. So being able to do this is definitely an honor. So thank you, Pam, for the invitation, and To everyone who's here listening, thank you as well. We have limited time, obviously, so I'm going to try to cover as much as I can while still leaving a little room for questions at the end. And if you want to, email questions as well, I'd be happy to answer those, and I'll make sure that my email gets shared. And I want this session to be practical. We here at CiRCE sometimes get accused of not being super practical, so I want to have some practical ideas for you. Some of them are practical in my mind, and as I was thinking, I was thinking to myself, well, maybe they're not so practical to everyone. So I'll try to explain why the ones that might not seem as practical, I think are practical. But I want to start with a question. And I should say, I guess, that I'm not here to talk necessarily about poetry as a literature class, and I'm not necessarily here to talk about poetry in terms of making your students good poets or cultivating good poets. I'm here to talk more about the concept of contemplation and paying attention and habits, things like that. So I want to start with a question, and you can just answer this in the affirmative with a Y in the chat box if you'd like. So how many of you would call yourselves what I'm just going to call lovers of poetry? Like, you are absolutely passionate about poetry. Maybe you've been passionate about poetry for a long time. I think I can see the chat box here. Yeah. So if there's anybody out there like that, type Y into the chat box. See if that works. Pam, I think you're a passionate poetry lover.
I am. I really do enjoy it. So, okay. So we have some learning to be.
So it's interesting because when I asked this question, I've asked it to classes of high school students that I've taught before, as well as other people that I've talked to. And I don't get a lot of affirmative responses to that. Or I get that what Megan just said, only some poems go over my head, which honestly, yeah, I think that's true of everybody. It's definitely true of me. Most poems, I think, go over our head at least the first time we read them. So then how many people out there would you call yourselves what I'll call an appreciator of poetry? So maybe you like it or you value it, but maybe you have a complicated relationship with it. Maybe you don't like it as much as you feel like you should. There's at least a few of those. So I love the sound of words. Writing poetry is what I love. Oh, that's good. That's interesting. That is a distinction, I guess. That's actually worth contemplating. Maybe if we have some time, we can talk about that. But like I think a lot of people, maybe most people just out there in the world, maybe not everybody on this, in listening to this webinar, but most people out there in the world have kind of a fraught relationship with poetry. I think that's how I would describe my relationship with poetry for most of my life. I think I liked it in school well enough, and I liked kind of doing imitations of poets that I would study in school. I liked talking about it and reading it, although I didn't necessarily like to read it by myself all the time. And I remember trying to write some pretty bad imitations of poems that we studied. There are two kinds of high schoolers, I like to say: the kind who write bad poetry and the ones who are too cool to even try. So I remember trying to write some pretty bad poetry, often imitating songwriters or bands that I liked. And so given the fact that those bands and songwriters were pretty bad poets in the first place, I'm kind of terrified to look back at what my imitations of bad poetry were. But then at the same time I was playing sports. I was involved in kind of that subculture as well. And I discovered pretty quickly that, like a sports team is not a place where poetry is particularly valued. Not a lot of football coaches are reciting poetry in their pregame speeches. Although now that I think about it, that may have been useful for them. Maybe more coaches should become poets. That might go a long way. And since then, I've, in addition to being able to teach, I've been able to spend a lot of time with high schoolers on, in sports teams, coaching and things like that, being around athletes, being around athletic departments, kind of in that culture, that athletic culture. And so as I've gotten older, I've realized, no, I really love poetry, but I also love sports. Pam mentioned that I like the Green Bay Packers. It's very true. I'm from Green Bay. And I've kind of had this internal dissonance, I think, in some ways, where I love sports. I've been part of that world. I love poetry. I get to be part of that world. And sometimes, when I'm like writing about sports, which I do sometimes, are involved with that sort of culture, it feels like it's so different than the world that my love of poetry it takes me into. On the one hand, you got poetry and kind of literature things, which are sort of bookish, and on the other kind of athletic type things. My wife always tells me that's just being a balanced human being. But and that's probably true. Like, it's good for our kids to like both of those kind of things, to be involved in both of those kind of things, to develop their minds and their bodies. But I felt for some reason, like the two aren't supposed to go together. Like, inside of me, there's this sort of dissonance, this sort of cognitive dissonance when I'm trying to bring them together. And I've been trying to figure out why that is. Why does poetry so often feel like it's set aside, like it's separate from the rest of the world, the rest of our lives? And in teaching high schoolers, I found that they feel pretty similarly. So when I start a year of teaching high schoolers, no matter what age they are, middle schoolers too, to some extent, I'll ask them what they think about poetry, how they feel about it, what their relationship has been with it. What would you guess is the most common? I guess I can't really, can't get too many answers on this, but what would you guess is the most common answer to that question? The most common, I would say 90%, that's just a guess, but 90% of the kids that I've asked that over the years say, I don't get it, I don't understand, it goes over my head, it's confusing. Rarely do I hear a kid say, well, if a kid said, I don't like it, why? And then what they usually say is, I don't get it, I don't understand, because it's going over my head, it's confusing. And, we don't generally as human beings like what we don't understand. It's kind of scary. And somehow over the years, for some reason, we've collectively as a culture made poetry into, I think the best word is a mystifying thing and a confusing thing, such that students are often scared of it, especially older kids that haven't been brought up around it a lot, which is why what you guys are doing is so important. We can avoid, by making poetry into a part of our daily lives, especially when our children are young, we can make it, we can minimize the amount that they're confused by it later. As a culture, though, I think we've accepted, maybe the culture at large, we've accepted the idea that poetry is separate. And I think, and I think that probably that's partly because themselves in the 20th century had something to do with that. They've maybe made it more complicated than it is. And there's this really interesting quote from a poet that I'm interested in. His name's Matthew Zapruder. I've talked about this before on some podcasts that I do. And he has a quote from a book called Why Poetry? And I'm going to see if I can share my screen here, and then we're going to see if we can get this to play. There we go. So this is a quote that he says. This is a working poet. He's been published many times. He's been an editor, and he's a poetry teacher at the university level. And he says, clearly there is something about poetry that rattles and mystifies people, that puts them off, that makes them feel as if there is something wrong. Students will even say they feel like poets are trying to be clever on purpose. I don't know if any of you who've taught middle schoolers or teenagers, or even felt this yourself, like they're just trying to be confusing and hide things. And that makes, I think, makes us feel uneasy. It makes us feel like we're being taken advantage of or tricked. And so that makes the experience of reading poetry not ideal. But poetry, as it should be, is not about gamesmanship or cleverness or anything like that. But I think that there's a reason why our culture maybe has bought into this concept. And I think it's because we spend a lot of time when we think about poetry thinking about the concept of interpretation, of the idea that if we're going to read poetry well, the only way to do that is by being able to interpret it completely. Because the idea is that without interpreting, we can't understand something. And I guess that is somewhat true, but my dad always told me something when I was young that has stuck with me. He started telling me this from a really young age, and I don't know why it occurred to him to say this, but he said this: understanding is overrated. And he meant it kind of as a joke, like he would say it kind of jokingly, but it's one of those things that over the years has kind of come to mean something to me. And I think it suggests in the context of poetry that poetry isn't about getting answers. It's much more about contemplation. And that is where it can become such an essential, or should be such an essential part of our daily lives and our liturgies and our habits and things like that. I want to read another quote from Matthew Zapruder here. And I hope you can follow along here. I hope you can read that. Poetry, he says, begins with the words of the poem, which sounds very simple and is, except that it quickly becomes very interesting. Reading poetry, we need to remember that we are all experts in words. We have been for a long time. And any word we don't know, we can look up in the dictionary. To learn to read poetry is first a matter of forgetting many incorrect things we have learned in school, and then of learning to accept what is right before us on the page. I have a friend, my friend Heidi, likes to repeat the adage that poetry teaches us to pay attention. In my opinion, this might be the most essential thing that poetry does for us, especially when it relates to our kids. Poetry can provide comfort. It can provide joy and companionship, all those sorts of things. It can tell a story. What else can it do? It can bring people together. Romance poetry, right? It can increase our vocabulary. That's a good one. And all those sorts of things. But I think that where it is especially soul transforming is in its unique ability to make us better at seeing, hearing, and contemplating, which in turn, I think ultimately can make us better neighbors, better friends, better churchgoers, better worshipers, better people. And so I think that the first step with our students and our kids and ourselves is to avoid this pitfall of thinking of poetry as something that we have to have answers for it to be useful. Attention is the first step to prayer, according to Simone Weil. Did I get that right? Simone Weil? I think that's how you say it. So I think we need to avoid that pitfall, especially with our young children. I think we need to avoid implying that or suggesting that. Instead, we need to pay attention to it. When C.S. Lewis talks about this in his books, he talks about the idea of submission a lot, that we need to submit to a book or a poem. And I like that because I think it puts us in a humble stance, like it gives us an action to do. I also like the idea of paying attention, or that terminology, because it also speaks to an action. It gives us something tangible that we can do, and it gives us something that we can focus on with our kids when we're dealing with poetry. So I think there are a few practical ways that we can do this. I've got 5 sort of practical things that I think we can do to help us pay attention with our kids and help cultivate that ability in our children, even from a young age. This first one might not seem practical, but I really, really think it is practical. And it's this: trust the poets. I think it's especially important that we trust the poets, especially the ones that the tradition, that history, that literary history has passed down to us. It's easy in this day and age to just assume that poets are looking to trick us or be clever. Some certainly are trying to do that, I suppose. Although I think probably less than we are inclined to think. I think what we need to assume is not that they are trying to trick us, but that they're trying to show us something. So if we can encourage our kids to look for what is there, that's going to be the best practice to help them learn to pay attention. That's what Matthew Zapruder is talking about. We should look for what is there and not for what isn't there, especially at first, especially with young children. And this is a question of posture. I was thinking about this because my 6-year-old Jeremiah, he takes violin lessons. And he's been doing this for about a year. And he loves it and he's really into it. But one of the things that he has spent a lot of time practicing, and his teacher has had to, reiterate over and over and over again, is this concept of posture. He spent, many lessons just practicing how to stand or how to hold the violin, or where does it go, where your fingers go, where does it go on your shoulder, how are your feet. There's a resting position and a playing position. Some of you know way more about this than I do because I don't play the violin, but it's been really interesting to see him have to practice this. It's the same with sports, right? My boys also play baseball, and I was thinking about this as relates to a batting stance. Because the idea of a batting stance is that it helps you see the ball, it helps you have proper technique to stay on top of the ball, make sure that your timing is right, all those sorts of things. But if your posture is not right in your batting stance, then your swing is going to be off. You're not going to be able to succeed in what you're trying to do. And I think the same is true in poetry. No matter what other things we end up doing to incorporate poetry into our lives and habits, to our schools, whatever the setting, whatever the age, if our posture towards poetry is wrong, then those other things won't be as useful or as powerful as they could be. And so I think that if we can teach our students and our kids from a young age to have a proper posture towards poetry and towards poets, that's going to go a long way. But that brings me to our second point. Don't ask kids to be experts on poetry too soon. I think that sometimes we feel like they need to know all the sort of the technical stuff, especially as kids get into, middle school, older elementary school, and definitely high school. And there is a place for that. And maybe it seems obvious to some of you, but people are pretty into, I find, including me, are pretty into our kids being smart and having a lot of knowledge. And I would, if my kids are experts, that's not the word. I think we kind of inherently sort of want that to happen. But it takes a long time to become an expert or to have that much knowledge. And most people, I would say, don't become experts at things that they don't love or at least like or have a passion for first. You don't usually spend enough time on something to become an expert in it unless you already love it. You don't become a Major League Baseball player, even if you have the skills to do it, unless you love it enough to work really hard at it. And the same is true with poetry, or I guess really anything. Our kids don't need to know what makes a villanelle right away in order to enjoy a villanelle. They don't need to know what makes a sonnet, or what the turn is in a sonnet, or what iambic pentameter is to be able to value or experience those things or enjoy those things. And I think one of the great things is that children can learn to value those things before they ever have a name for them. And they're not as caught up in knowing names of things like that as we are. And I think that's there's sort of an inherent positive posture towards poetry that's there with kids, that sometimes, because we want them to not have a lot of knowledge, we sometimes, I don't want to say we push it out of the way, but we sometimes can bury it by our desire for them to have knowledge. They have this sort of inherent posture of curiousness, and they trust the poets. Going back to my first point, they trust the poets more than we do probably. And the thing is that the more they learn to just see what's there, the more they just learn to spend time with a poem or with a poet or even a specific line, they begin to observe what's there. They're going to learn to see how many lines are in a sonnet or the repetitions in a villanelle or a sestina or something like that. They're going to see those things before we ever point them out. And then all our job is to give them names, I guess, which reminds me of a quote by David Hicks. I think I included it here. David Hicks wrote the book Norms and Nobility, and he has this quote that is thought-provoking, at least. I don't know if it's always true, but he says it's the mark of a bad teacher to answer a question before it's been asked. So our job is to provide a context for them to care, maybe a context for their knowledge that we're going to be able to give to them to be personal and impacting and to take root and mean something more than just a fact for them. Which I think brings me to a third point. This is practical, but also maybe it goes without saying, but I felt like I needed to say it anyway. There's so much value in reading widely. Read a lot of different forms, a lot of different kinds of poets from a lot of different eras. Show them the breadth of poetry. That poetry isn't a narrow thing that is easily defined. Invest in a good anthology. That's a tip. Three that I love that I have at the end here under resources are The Harp and Laurel Wreath, which is by Laura Berquist. She's the editor of that. The 100 Greatest Poems, I think that's the name of it. I forgot to grab it. But that's edited by William Harmon. And then Greatest Poems of the English Language, or Best Poems of the English Language, which is edited by Harold Bloom. Those are three that are really good. There's lots of poems there that give you a good balance. Lots of men and women, people from all kinds of different parts of the world. Don't be afraid to pursue the things that they love and that you love as well. If you love Wordsworth, dive deep into Wordsworth, dive deep into the Romantics or sonnets, or if you love a 19th century Argentine poet, it turns out, sometimes when you kind of dive into traditions that you're not familiar with, you'll find poets that, kind of rock your world and that your kids love. They come from surprising places. Don't be afraid to go hole and geek out about Argentine 19th century poets if you want to. So there is a sense in which following your bliss, as my mom used to say, don't follow your bliss too much. There is a degree to which that is a valuable thing, but then, don't let that bliss be the entirety of their poetic landscape. So it's okay to dive deep, but reading widely allows them to not let their bliss, so to speak, be too narrow. It's kind of a strange way to put it, I suppose, but I think it is valuable. Well, I'll say this for the end. There's a series of anthologies that I want to mention, but I'll save it for the end. This brings me to the fourth one: repeat, repeat, repeat. Part, I think, of contemplation, especially of poetry, is the ability to see what is there, and you're not going to see what is there if you look at something just once. You're not going to see everything that is there anyway. I was thinking about this, like if you go to a museum, say, or you go to the Sistine Chapel, and you look up at the Sistine Chapel, or you look at the Mona Lisa or something like that, or some Rembrandt painting in a museum, you're not going to go there, look at the one time, and then feel like you know that painting, right? Or that you've seen everything in it, or that you know exactly what the painter was doing with light, or either a certain sort of stroke or something like that. You're going to say, okay, I need to go back and look at it, or I'm going to get a print and put it in my house. I mean, that's why we put beautiful artwork up in our house, right? So we can look at it over and over and over and spend time with it and come back to it. We can just glance at it, and that, just by glancing at it again, it can add that much more meaning. It can be that much more powerful, and build our relationship with that, such that eventually over time it becomes part of our sort of inner life, part of our imagination. And I think when a beautiful painting, like, remember when you're a kid, this is kind of an aside, when you're a kid and your parents have a painting or a photograph in your house and you see it all the time, you see it every day, say multiple times a day, maybe you walk past it all the time, it becomes such a part of your imagination that years later when you're an adult, it comes back to you sometimes. And things like that will come back in the strangest times. Sometimes when you need it, sometimes when it's just random. But I think that poetry can work the same way. Hopefully we're rereading poems. Hopefully we're rereading novels as well, by the way. And if there's a great movie, if something's great, it's probably worth spending time with more than one time. So reread, go back to poems. There's a habit that I really like to do, where I'll take a poem that I know I should love, or that I do love, or that someone has told me that I should love, and I'll keep a journal where for a whole week I'll write that poem down. I'll copy it down into a journal, and then maybe on the opposite page, if my handwriting is not too big, then I'll write what I observe about that poem. So on Monday I might do that, and the next day I'll flip the page and I'll write that poem down again. I'll copy it down again, and then I'll make a new set of observations, and I'll do that every day for a week. And you'll it's amazing the things that you see, or the way your observations change, the way somebody said here they're reading Herbert poems 2 days in a row, and then also read 6 Donne poems and then reread them. So there's all different kinds of ways you can do this. I've noticed with my kids that the idea of doing something over the course of a week and having them make observations about it almost has the effect of narration, where if I read a poem to them, say I read a Herbert or a Donne poem, and then I just ask them to make observations, and then I write down their observations, and maybe I just keep them and set them aside, and then we come back the next day and they do the same thing. Maybe I ask them to narrate back the poem, and then tell me what they see the second day. It's amazing the way they almost have it memorized by the end of the week, even if they don't have it word for word. The sort of the mechanisms of their memory have sort of been keyed up, and they've gotten started, and so they're well on their way to memorizing it. And then the poem almost becomes like a living thing in a sense. It begins to change and evolve in their imagination, not the poem itself, but because they're beginning to see new things in it, the relationship is starting to change, and the poem is taking on more and more life. And those are the things that are so great about poems, because the greatest poets have so much buried under the surface. And when we do this, when we repeat and repeat and repeat, kids naturally begin to identify subtext. We talk a lot about how when kids are older, we want them to be able to be prepared to identify the subtext. And a lot of times when adults or college students talk about poetry, that's really all you end up talking about is subtext. What are the ideas that are buried in here? Because that's what we think that it's all about. But the thing is that when kids naturally do this from a young age, then that subtext becomes something that becomes natural to them. They start to observe it, almost without us having to say anything. It's kind of organic in a way. It was the word that I was thinking of, kind of natural. And then again, it's like earlier what I was saying, then all you have to do is help them just learn how to discuss it and give it names. Because they'll start to ask the questions on their own. And then, as I said, this is the seed of memorization. You can begin memorizing anytime. 2-year-olds can start memorizing things. But when you memorize things that they've repeated, it begins to, that seed of memory is planted to think a little bit deeper, and they remember longer, I think. Which brings me to the last tip, and I actually have no idea how much time we have left. I think we're up against it, but
it doesn't matter. Keep going. You're doing great.
Okay. All right. This is my last sort of tip, and this one is really practical. And I know a lot of you already do this, but I thought I'd mention it anyway. Let the seasons guide you. On the Daily Poem, the podcast that Pam mentioned that we do, this has been really helpful for me, because when I started the podcast, I didn't really think anyone was going to listen. Then once people started listening, I kind of had to keep doing it. But then I started realizing that how do you choose all the different poems? And anthologies help, but being able to kind of fall back on the structure of the seasons is really helpful. And there are two ways that I like to do this. There's the nature seasons, autumn, spring, summer, and so forth. But there's also, for those of you who are churchgoers, there's also the church calendar, because there are seasons just within the church. Even, the lowest church people, the concept of high church and low church with the calendars and liturgies and all that. Even in people who are, quote, low church, there's still Christmas and Easter and things like that. And there's a wide breadth of poetry that are tied to both of those seasons. But one thing I really like about this, being tied to the seasons, is that poems that are about the seasons, such as right now, it's autumn, right? I mean, ostensibly, it's kind of autumn here where I live in North Carolina. It's almost there. We can almost open our windows without being miserable. But a lot of poetry that's about the seasons is very sensory. It's very tied to smells, or the Ode to the West Wind, right? There are. I do, and I will say those at the end. Megan just asked if I have any recommendations for books that have religious poems in them. But because those kind of poems are sensory, even the ones that are tied to the church calendar, because of that, those sensory details offer kids something to, I think the best word is to kind of latch onto. Whether they're memorizing them or not, that's really useful. So there's plenty to observe, to see, to feel. Like I said, there's wind and rain and leaves and all these things they have personal experiences with. Whereas some poems are a little more abstract, or they're about things that kids don't have a lot of experience with. Like even a Shakespearean sonnet, let's say about, falling in love with somebody or falling out of love with somebody. Not a lot of 7 and 8 year olds have a ton of experience with that concept, but they do understand the concept of leaves or wind. And so you've got great poems that are dealing with those sorts of things, that are very profound, very deep, that are giving them a lot to chew on, but also are tied to things that even a 7-year-old has a lot of experience with. Robert Louis Stevenson has poems that are great for little kids that are about this as well. But so does Wordsworth. There's so many great poets that little kids can memorize as well. So yeah, nature poems are beautiful and they're lovely, but they also provide a really fertile ground to plant the seeds of poetry love, I guess, if you'll excuse that metaphor. There are a few anthologies I want to mention for this. I'll just do that right now. Someone mentioned to me actually this week a book called A Nature Poem for Every Day of the Year, which is edited by Jane McMorland Hunter. Some of you may already have that. And then I really like if you're familiar with the Everyman Pocket Library series, they're a nice little book that, they're hardback, so they don't really go in a pocket, but they're great for a backpack. But you can this one is on the 4 seasons, and then there's one here that's on Christmas poems. So they have a whole series of things like that, as well as little anthologies of specific poets. So the Everyman seasonal editions are really good. And, I wanted to touch on this a little bit, not just because it's useful, and I'll conclude here, but because, as William Carlos Williams said, there are no ideas but in things. I don't know if any of you have ever heard that before. No ideas but in things. William Carlos Williams wrote that. And I know that increasingly we want even our youngest kids to eventually be able to grow into ideas that show up in poetry, to sort of become familiar with them, to grasp them, and to interact with them, and then eventually to be able to express them, right? But if they aren't prepared to see those ideas through things, then those ideas will be disembodied in abstractions that won't mean as much to them. So one of my favorite books of poetry actually talks about this a little bit. And if you know me, this won't be a surprise to you. It's by Wendell Berry. And he has a book specifically about William Carlos Williams. It's called The Poetry of William Carlos Williams of Rutherford. And the first bit of that book is about his ideas, but then the last half is just about poetry more generally. And he has a quote about William Carlos Williams. And he says this: when Williams sets down this manifesto, No Ideas But in Things, he's not being odd or silly or unintelligent, and what he said was not unprecedented. He was accepting a limit for himself and his own work, first of all, that would protect things from the limitlessness of abstract ideas or abstract definitions, abstract rule in cases. Things properly mark the limit of ideas. Now, side note, I know this quote is a little bit abstract, but I'll explain some of what I'm thinking here, my connection here in a second. There he goes on. They also impose a discipline upon those generalities, so that the generalities don't become so general as to be unknown and unfelt in embodied particularity. So that they do not, so to speak, escape imagination and form. The tangible defines and disciplines the intangible. Concern for ideas in the absence of a concern for things at the expense of things is capricious and dangerous both to things and to ideas. So that's a pretty bold statement there at the end. But I think that this is part of why we do read poetry and why we should read poetry to our children. And it's why we have to read poetry without an idea for answers or interpretations or abstractions first. And it's why we have to begin by looking and by seeing. Because all of those habits that bring poetry into our lives, I think, need to be in support of that seeing, especially with children, especially at first. I think even for ourselves as adults, that's the place we have to start. So if our habits are not in support of that, then I think we're putting the cart before the horse, so to speak. And I think that this will improve our children's relationship with poetry and our relationship with poetry, and it will make it less mystifying in the long run, but it also will prepare them for future thought. And it might even order their minds in a really healthy way where they're able to think more abstractly because they first have been able to think about concrete poetic things. Is what you see a lot in epic poetry, the epic simile, where this really complex idea is presented through a simile in, say, the Iliad or the Odyssey. It gives life to the work, but it also is allowing us to use our imaginations to contemplate a really complex idea. And so when we do this with our kids when they're young, I think this helps them for later on in life as well. I'm going to conclude with this, move ahead a little bit, but go back to Matthew Zapruder. This book is really interesting. Where did I put it? It came out a year or two ago. It's called Why Poetry. I thought there was a subtitle, but there's not. So Why Poetry by Matthew Zapruder. And he writes this: poets, according to Wallace Stevens, help us live our lives, not by telling us what to think or by comforting us. They do so by creating spaces where one individual imagination can activate another. Poems are imaginative structures built out of words, ones that any reader can enter. They're places of freedom, enlivenment, true communion. One could say correctly that this is true of any form of literature or any use of language even. But because poetry remains free of all the other obligations that any use of language inevitably must take on, and by the way, he's talking about things like plot there. He's talking about other sorts of writing have to attend to plot, characterization, things like that. But because poetry can remain free of those sorts of things, usually, it can be devoted purely to the creation of these spaces where one imagination in the company of another can remember what it is to be alive and free. I think that the creation of those imaginative spaces is really necessary work. And I think that that's what we can do in our homes. We can create those spaces by creating contemplative environments. And then we can let their imaginations and our imaginations work together in communion almost. And I think that's a really powerful thing. Hopefully the 5 things that I mentioned today in 20 minutes or 25 minutes or whatever will help do that. I know some of these are maybe a little obvious and maybe some of them don't seem practical, but I think in the end, hopefully they are practical. That's what I have for now. Here's a list of suggested resources here. And I wanted to go through a couple of these because there's a couple that I didn't mention in the talk that I really want to mention. Did you have a second for me to go through this, or should we just leave this? Okay, cool. So there's Why Poetry, which I mentioned. There's a great book called The Making of a Poem. It's a Norton book by Mark Strand and Avon Boland. This is a classic. I highly recommend it. It's got stuff on all the different kinds of poetry. But the best thing about it is it'll have anthologies of the different sorts of things. So if you want to mix it up sometimes, even if you don't necessarily want to teach your kids yet what a sonnet is or a villanelle is, there are still different kinds of, you and me both, Pam. Amazon cart's filling up all the time, right? There are a lot of different kinds of poems for you to draw from. And then when it is time to start giving names to things that they're seeing, it's a great resource to turn to. There's also those Everyman books that I said. These look beautiful on the shelf, by the way. I have several of them, so you just line them up. They're great Christmas decorations, colorful. This is a giant book this is great. A Poet's Glossary by Edward Hirsch. This has a lot of definitions and things like that. Like I said, it's giant. So if you're want to do a deep dive on something, it's great. But also there are just little tips in here for doing things that are on a more rudimentary level that might be useful with your kids. This is I like this one. It's called The Little Book on Form by Robert Haas. It's not little. It's 450 pages. So, poet's wit there, I guess. Next little bit of irony. Great book as well. One that has a lot of different kinds of poems as well. So if you're looking to mix that up as well. And then of course there's the ones that I mentioned already. Mary Oliver's book, A Poetry Handbook. It's around here somewhere. But that's a great one. And the poetry of William Carlos Williams, The 100 Greatest Poems. Those are all ones that I mentioned. I did want to mention Thomas Banks. Some of you know Angelina Stanford. I've been working with her over the years, and she has a podcast that she does, The Literary Life with Cindy Rollins. Her husband did a webinar for her recently on cultivating a love of poetry, and he was able to get pretty deep on some things. And I really, really recommend that. If you go to angelinastanford.com, you can check that out. I sent a message to him to make sure that was still available, and it looks like you can still go get that. I think you have to buy it. I can't remember exactly what it is. Off the top of my head, I should have checked. I'm sorry. But I highly recommend that webinar that Thomas Banks did with Angelina. All right, so $15. Yeah, and I knew he was doing a second one on Greek myths and things like that.
Yeah, mythology and poetry is the next one. Yeah.
He's a great poet. In fact, we've published him in our magazine before a couple years ago, and his webinars are great. I think he might be a genius on poetry, so I highly recommend you check that out. So those are some resources, and there's find anthologies that you love, find anthologies that are full of poets that you love, but hopefully those 5 things can help guide you a little bit. I went over. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. We've had a request for you to put the slide with the 5 things back up again. Now, I will tell you, David has said he'll send us slides, and so we can put a PDF of these in the replay page. But here is the 5 tips for paying attention again. So these were awesome.
I don't really know why the second one is smaller, except that Keynote or whatever must have decided that it was too much text to make it the same size font as the other ones.
Maybe it looks very artistic. I figured it was a Graham thing.
Well, Graham did design the background with all the grid of poets' faces. We had fun choosing poets to go there, so he put Wendell Berry right in the middle.
Cersei stuff is always really beautiful. So
Graham Pittman does an amazing job. So
he does. Graham Pittman is awesome. All right, guys, any questions for David before we let him go and head off home to those kids? And I'm sure
we got baseball practice in a little bit.
Okay, I was going to say he's going to be reading some poems, but I guess they're doing sports instead.
We'll do that. We'll do that afterwards.
Balanced life. It's good. Yeah. We do want to mention while you're, if you have any questions while you're putting them in there, we want to remind you that the Daily Poem is sponsoring our poetry contest for Fall in Love with Morning Time. And so if you haven't had a chance yet to have your kids pick a 10-line poem with the theme of fall, go ahead and do that and do a little call and repeat or memory palace it if you want to. I showed you guys how to do that in a session last week. And you just need to post your poem. So what you do is you get your child to recite it. And let me give you a little tip. You could have all 3 kids be in one video together, but if you want 3 chances to win the prize, do 3 separate videos.
Yeah.
And have them recite the poem, post it on social media, and hashtag it with your morning basket and daily poem contest by October 31st. And we're going to go through and choose 3 winners in 3 different age categories. And David and the Circe Institute and the Daily Poem are awesome because they're going to provide books from the Folio Society. Each winner in each age group will get a chance to choose a book. What if they don't have an Instagram, David?
I would say Facebook works.
Okay.
I mean, you should use those hashtags still, right?
Yeah, use the hashtags and we will search them out. We'll go on Facebook and search out those hashtags to make sure that we see your entry.
Yeah, I mean, who has time to keep up with all the social media networks, right? Nobody. Yeah. Something gets a little bit left behind, I suppose.
All right. It looks like I haven't seen any more questions, and we'll have all of the information up for you in the recording. Add the Daily Poem to your podcast app and download it. That you're looking for a way to contemplate poetry daily. That's probably the easiest way out there to do it. So.
Yeah, we try to, like I said, we try to stick with the seasons. We try to make the episodes always under 10 minutes. You know, sometimes they're 5 to 8 usually. And we try to, we read it once. Usually it's me. Sometimes we'll have a guest person, but we'll read it one time, offer a few comments, and then read it one more time. Get that repetition in there. But yeah, I did not, like I said, I didn't expect as many people to listen to it. It was kind of more for me and my family and see what would happen. But then it seems like people are using it for morning time, which is, it's an honor. So to everyone who does that, thank you. It's pretty cool hearing from kids who are listening to poetry, although I feel sorry for them. They have to listen to me say it, but
I say that all the time. I record poems for our subscription for our members in our subscription for Memory Work. And I tell the moms, it's like, I apologize. Your children are going to recite poetry in a Southern accent. And sorry. So
yeah,
exactly. Well, thank you so much, David. We really appreciate you coming on. This was awesome.
Thank you.
So love it.
You. Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it. It really is an honor. I mean that.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. And we will have the replay up for you. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.